Okay, we'll kick off now. A few people still are joining, but we'll start with a few housekeeping slides that we've got. Thank you all for joining our market-wide half-hourly walkthrough PIT guidance session today. Can we just pop to the housekeeping slides? Yeah, thank you. So as part of co-bodies in the programme, working collaboratively with participants to provide you with all the guidance and support and information that you need to complete your PIT deliverables, we're holding today's session to walk you through the PIT guidance. We do ask participants today to share their questions via Slido. So join Slido at slido.com with the hashtag PIT, and I'll put that in the chat so that everyone can see those and joining instructions. So we do have a dedicated Q&A session that will occur after the walkthrough. Usually this is about 15 minutes, but obviously it depends how quickly we get through the material that we've got. So yeah, we do encourage you to submit your questions on Slido. They'll all be answered either in session, or what we'll do is take those away and complete an FAQ document that will be provided to participants alongside to support this session. What we'll usually do first is provide a recording and the slides themselves and provide that to participants, and then we'll follow up middle of next week with an FAQ document that takes you through all the questions that have asked and the answers that have been given. We would also like to just remind everyone that we want to keep the topics related to the PIT guidance only to ensure that we're focused on that specifically. And again, that's slido.com hashtag PIT to join the Slido. So we're going to have a quick introduction by V at the retail energy code. Then we're going to walk through the PIT scope, the walkthrough and the Q&A, and that will be with V, Matt and Nicola, Matt from Alexon and Nicola from the programme. And then I'll close off the meeting, including that Q&A, and we'll walk through all your questions that we can in the session, and then we will follow up again just to say that we're going to send you all the documents that you need and the FAQ document in the middle of next week. Okay, I'll hand you to V.
Thank you, George. So for the session was organized after we took an action at the last QWG meeting in March, where participants had requested clarification on what the PIT scope for qualification is. So I will be handing over to Matt in a minute, who will take us through the definition we've looked at following the feedback. We've clarified it a bit more, and we've also developed some examples of how that definition can be applied for various different roles. On this slide, we've also given a reminder of the timelines that were set for non-SIT LDSOs and non-SIT suppliers and agents for when various PIT deliverables will be due. So this remains as it previously was. I will just say one thing. Yes, George has introduced the Slido link. It would be useful when you're asking a question if you can specify which role you may be asking that question on the basis of, because that might change how our response is going to be. So please mention the role at the start of your question if you can. Thank you. So without further ado, I will hand over to Matt now.
Good morning, everyone. Or afternoon. So what we've thought we'd bring first is the definition for PIT in terms of the requirement for qualification. So all market participants intending to operate within the new MHHS arrangements are required to perform the pre-integration testing, or PIT, to validate every system or service that is included in the full MHHS design for compliance with the MHHS functional, migration, non-functional and operational requirements. This includes back office systems if affected. The system/service may have several components, and PIT for qualification refers to the testing conducted when those components have all been internally integrated and where all components are tested to ensure that the market participant can perform all steps for their market role as defined within the MHHS business processes. This should include interfaces with any system within their architecture that generates or ingests information required as part of the MHHS business processes that may come from or go to systems not defined within the MHHS design. Now, we have created some illustrative examples. So we have developed some examples of how this definition should be applied for market participants. So we've got a change of supply, which is coincidentally with change of agent, which is business process 1, 2, and 3, as well as a change of registration data for business process 10. And then for the PIT scope for metering services, this is business process 08 and 09 for change of energization status and change of metering. And then for a PIT scope for data services for the data collection, which is BP 004. And then I'll hand over to Nicola, who will talk us through the PIT scope for LDSO, which is the disconnection, which is BP 07, and market-wide data service BP 19, as well as the reporting, reports. So if we could go next. So for key principles for interpreting the examples dictated in the following slides, any market messages listed are for illustrative purposes and is not expected to be a full list. Market messages sent via DIP or DTN are undergoing changes and therefore should form part of PIT evidence. CSS messages may be required to complete the business process steps as part of the test case, but are not subject to assurance as there are no changes to CSS messages. Interactions with other market participants are depicted to illustrate how market messages will flow in live operations and are not expected to be covered in PIT. Each example illustrates the chosen business processes from the perspective of one market role under test, which has been specified. The same processes may be required testing from the perspective of other market roles that those are depicted in the example, in which case their PIT scope would differ. For example, a supplier requesting metering works and receiving meter updates, the PIT scope will be different from example 4. Now, the examples shared are not a full list of business processes that the various market roles would need to demonstrate coverage of. For the purpose of pre-qualification submission, or the PQS, and place and reliance, the expectation is a similar approach will be followed by participants, as outlined in the examples, to identify systems to be covered within their system architecture. When place and reliance, programme participants may ensure they can demonstrate full coverage of PIT as defined, i.e. ensuring coverage of any integration between various systems which may be hosted by different third parties or internally. Go to the next slide. So this is example 1 of the PIT scope. So please note this example covers the change of supply coincidental with change of agent process from a supplier perspective only. So as you can see in the middle, so for all of the illustrative examples, we've generated them from kind of the middle. So this is a gaining supplier system that generates and processes market messages. So as you can see here, that the interaction for all the messages are shown in blue. So all of those are the class of the in scope of market of the MHHS design and qualification. The red symbolises the consequential change for market participants currently, which is not in scope of the MHHS design and qualification. And then the red dotted on the right hand side is external interaction, which is not in scope. So as you can see here, so for this example, the customer contract information between the supplier and the system that's holding that customer information, which could be a CRM. However, each system may be varied. That customer contract information is sent to and from. Now it could have a separate system that has the system holding agents information. So that's when those flows are to and from, which would be in scope. The same for the CSS messages. So the CSS messages itself could be in scope. However, the actual CSS simulator wouldn't be, and the same with the DTN. So the DTN flows, those could be potentially in scope. However, the DTN itself isn't scope, and the same with the other market messages. So the dip, for example, the actual to and from the dip is in scope, including the dip simulator. However, if the dip simulator then needs to send a further flow to another party, this wouldn't necessarily be in scope. However, the dotted line is just to symbolise how market messages will flow in the live operation, and it's not expected to be covered in PIT. And next. And then the same again. So this is for a change of registration data processes from a supplier perspective. So as you can see here, that you've got the supplier system that generates and processes the market messages in the middle. To the right hand side, you've got where it's going to and from the dip simulator. So yet again, that would be in scope. And then the CRM that says where it says update supplier records, and then the supplier triggers request for change. So that system itself is in scope. However, obviously system step-ups may vary. And then yet again, the same for the below one. This is the consequential change for market participants, which is currently not in scope of the MHHS design and qualification. And then as you can see, that the dip simulator has to and from flows leading to other market participants. And if I hand over to V to talk through the metering services.
Thanks, Matt. So over here, we've got an example for how the PIT scope for a metering service can be determined when looking at the change of energization process. So again, we've got in the middle, as Matt said, the metering service system itself that would generate and process market messages. Now, that metering system would receive, for example, an energization request from the DTN, which would trigger the process. It would then send on instructions to their field staff. So it may be communicating with the separate systems to send those instructions out. We would want those to be shown within PIT. Similarly, field staff would conduct the job and be sending in the response to the fieldwork to the metering system. So we would need to see that the integration that has been tested as well, and that the message is received, which is then used to populate the outgoing messages over DTN and DIP as required. Again, we've got the DIP simulator that we've shown within the box. So that is an example for metering service for change of energization. If we move to the next slide, please. Similarly, we've got for change any metering works, could be installation, removals, exchanges, etc. Again, very similar to the previous example. The request comes in through DTN, which then would trigger instructions to the field staff systems, which would then, after the work's done, would create some sort of a response flow, which go back into the metering service system to then populate the relevant MTD flows or DIP interfaces as required. Again, we've shown the boundaries of what we would expect the PIT to cover. So that's that. If we move to the next slide, and I think I'm handing back over to Matt to take us through a data service example.
Yes, thanks, V. So this is a data service system that generates and processes market messages. So to the right hand side, you've got the data collection for staff for traditional meters. So this could be an instruction for site visits and then response following the site visits. You then have the interaction between the system and the DTN gateway. So this will be sending the D flows. You've also got the interaction with the MDR, so the system requests that you could send if you were, for example, especially with an SDS. This is a service request that you'd send to them and then receive. The MDR obviously is qualified by the SEC, so even though it makes up for the role within PIT, it will be more the flows that you're sending to and from the MDR. And then the same with the DIP simulator and the DIP messages that you're sending them to and from. And the same again with the other market participants. Market participants are likely to send and receive flows through the DTN or the DIP. So that's just to illustrate how the market messages will flow in live operations. However, this is not expected to be covered in PIT. And as you can see, what the boundary is. So I think I'm now handing over to Nicola to then just talk us through the next slide, which is the LDSO slide.
Hi, afternoon, everyone. This is an example of LDSO, so it's covering LDSO, UMSO and registration services. And this is the business process 7, so disconnection. So within this, we're expecting PIT to cover the interactions between the registration services, network ops and UMSO, as well as CSS's interaction with registration services, the interaction with the DIP adapter and the DTN. It's worth noting that we're not expecting parties to repeat the same level of PIT that St Clements have carried out on registration services, but we are expecting parties to ensure that interactions and regression within their own PIT is covered. And similarly, some LDSOs are able to opt out of some DIP publications. So I think in this case, it would be the Pub 13. So if an LDSO is going to opt out of receiving a Pub 13, we wouldn't expect their PIT to show them receiving that, but to show that they are able to receive the same information via the alternative mechanism that they have in place. Next slide. This covers the reporting for LDSOs. So within this one, we would be expecting PIT to cover the receipt of the report. So that would be Rep 02, 02A and Rep 8. And this would be receipt to 2A, Rep 2 and 2A would be receipt to the DOS billing system, and then the DOS billing generating the Rep 900 and 901 report. It's worth saying that the scope of PIT should only reflect the scope of the design. So in this case, it's around generation of a successful report that meets the design spec. It's not around the accuracy of the content within that report. It's worth also noting that there are some limitations on the DIP simulator when it comes to reporting. The DIP simulator only validates a report as a string. It doesn't validate the contents, and it isn't also able to support compression or compression logic. And I think that's the next. Move on to the next slide, please. I think I'm handing back over to George.
Fantastic, yeah. So just say we will be providing a recording of today's session alongside the slides, and they'll be made available either this afternoon or early tomorrow. And then the FAQ document that will be taking all the questions that you provided today will be provided probably the middle of next week, and we will signpost that in the clock as well as any newscasts as required, just to make sure that you're and that everyone in today's session has received that. So yeah, while we're here, please do, and while we're going through the questions, please do continue to send those questions in at slido.com with the hashtag PIT, and we'll start with the first ones that came in. So this was from a supplier at DCP. Can we assume that dispensations will be granted for PIT evidence impacted by any DIP simulator bugs or limitations?
Yep, I can take that. So where parties do note any bugs, I think those need to be reported through the defects process to the program. And the expectation would be that once that's resolved, you complete your testing and demonstrate that evidence. Where defects are noted within the party's own PIT, again, those would need to be documented correctly, and wherever there is a need to agree any work-off plans, those would need to be agreed with the code bodies as part of the PIT exit activities, PIT completion reporting activities that we've outlined.
And from another supplier, this is a two-parter. So are systems marked under consequential changes also in scope for PIT, including any evidence submissions?
So we have removed the concept of DBT1 and DBT2. We have clarified that. So the examples we've depicted today are what we deem as MHHS changes. So they would be in scope for PIT for qualification. I don't know if Francesca, if we can just go to the supplier example, 1 or 2 on the slides, please. Yeah, thank you. So as you can see over here in this example itself, we're saying change of supply, you need to show us the system from which the contract information, agent information is coming in to send out those messages over CSS DTN. And also once the supply has the change has completed, again, incoming messages are processed and your system such as CRM is updated to reflect those effective, like the supplier's start date and all of those information. Now, some of this information might also be consumed by our other systems. We've got the red box on the side, which basically shows the billing, pricing, any customer portals, any metering dialing systems, etc. Those are not specifically part of the full MHHS design. So those would be what we class as consequential changes that parties would be looking at testing for themselves. But those would not be a part of MHHS qualification as the codes, as the scope stands today, because our qualification activity is focused on the delivery of the MHHS changes itself. Hopefully that clarifies the question.
Sorry, Anup here. I raised that question. So, and that's exactly the reason why I raised that question. And now that you have confirmed, and again, correct me if I'm wrong. We have to prove PIT from a CRM perspective, because that's where either the process is originating or ends, and that could be the reason why it's within PIT. But still, the question remains that should we put the consequential changes, systems under consequential changes in PIT, which you partially answered that we shouldn't be, I mean, the quad will not be bothered about that because that will be dealt by the participants themselves, because those are internal systems where they deal with it. So again, to reiterate my question, is systems under consequential systems, changes, are part of PIT or not?
So, but you're talking about the red big box, yeah?
Yes.
And like there might be, there's only a few examples. So as today, the scope of qualification stands, they're not going to be a part of your PIT that you need to demonstrate to us. I believe there's other conversations happening which might change this position, but if any changes do happen in future, those will go through the MHHS change process and that will be communicated separately. But as of today, that is not in scope.
So the reason for the question is that as you're now blurred out the line between DPT1 and DPT2, I mean, there is no more DPT1 and DPT2. So how do you differentiate between like what we are delivering as part of it? So usually what we do is that we have phase 1 and phase 2. Forget about DPT1 and DPT2. Phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 is nothing but what we include within PIT, and phase 2 is nothing but what we include post PIT. So as we don't have DPT1 and DPT2 anymore, like how do we differentiate, or is it it's up to the participant how we need to handle it?
So yeah, so these examples have been put forward, like the definition itself, and these examples are been put forward to help the participants understand how they distinguish what that scope of PIT that they need to show us is. Fine, so okay. It's all the MHHS design change, MHHS design delivery that you need to do. You need to look at it from the trigger point until the completion point. If that information is then going to be consumed by other processes and systems, that's not part of MHHS design, then that's currently not in scope. So that should help you use this and apply to all the other business processes as well. Similarly.
No, yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Thank you.
Question from another supplier relating to end-to-end multiple messages and operational choreography, where there's multiple on-off enterprise messages. How is it best to evidence that working?
So we're currently looking at it from a functional side, like our examples have basically been how you're showing the functional side of the process. When you're talking about multiple, like the operational choreography itself, like I'm not sure, like, are you talking it from a PIT operational point of view, or are you basically saying that the sequencing of multiple messages going in and how that is consumed by your system? How you're going to evidence that?
That was my question. If everything's stubbed out and simulated, I was just really asking, are we looking at each sequence of on-off messages in isolation and you're not expecting any evidence that the multiple message set has completed correctly. You're literally just looking at each instance of an on-off message rather than instances where multiple messages are involved to achieve a functional outcome.
So would that be as an example wherein, like, for a switch to go ahead, you'd expect messages from CSS as well as, like, as a supplier from DIP as well? So are you talking about, so from our side, we're only looking at that you, as Matt said previously, that the CSS messages are not undergoing any change. So where the supplier needs to make sure that that CSS message and that IF message has been received before they register it as a completed switch, that is something that suppliers need to build into their PIT system. We won't specifically go and see whether you've routed that CSS message correctly, because we don't expect the routing of that to be changing at all with MHHS design. So our assurance will not be focused on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic. And so this is relating to where suppliers and agents, they're not required to submit non-functional test approach and plan until mid-May. But why are qualification parties required to submit a non-functional test approach and plan in April?
So we've answered this previously at the PQS webinar as well, and I'll repeat my answer to that. In order to allocate people to QT waves, we need the best view we can have of parties' readiness by when they'll complete all of their PIT. That's why we've asked parties to give us the best possible view they can of within their PIT approach and plan of all the various phases of PIT. We appreciate there might be some unknowns at this point, and there might be things that are less mature. So if you can highlight what those items are within your submission, we can build that into our planning process. Parties will have the opportunity to tell us when their PIT approach and plan firms up, and if any aspects of it move around or change, we would ask parties to tell us so that we can reassess and ensure that their allocated waves can still be achieved.
And this is from a supplier and a MOP. How do we validate the correct scope on all PIT testing, as boundaries may change for different scenarios?
I think we can agree from an assumption point of view. I think where we've aligned the CSS adapter, for example, is out of scope. Where we've got the DTN gateways itself is out of scope, but the DTN flows are in scope. I think it's clear that the actual scenario is quite interchangeable. So I think whether you have, depending on the DIP flows that you're sending itself, we know that DIP adapter is in scope and all the DIP messages that you're sending to and from. But if you have to send any to market participants, we know that that's out of scope for PIT.
Matt, sorry, I asked that question.
Yeah.
Less about the external simulators and more about the internal workings of our CRM systems, or what we class as CRM, because some may send and receive, but also be party to consequential flows. So in your diagram, we've got like a bit of a merge of what's in red to what's in blue. Yeah. And therefore, how do we, and that might differ for different, you've got some examples here, some good examples, but that might differ for different examples, because some of that functionality will be in our CRM and some of it will be outside of our CRM. So
I would use the logic of, in order to send the DTN messages and the DIP messages, are you using information from any of those components? If yes, then that goes into the blue territory. If not, then that will go into the red territory.
So it's just where we're sending and receiving messages.
Yeah, I think, and even in the definition, I think we said this should include interfaces with any system within their architecture that generates or ingests information as part of the MHHS business processes that may come from or go to.
Okay.
So we got another question from, sorry. Sorry. So we got another question from a supplier. Will reporting and settlements form a scope of PIT for suppliers, as they'd like to understand better the boundaries here?
I think I'll have to take that one away from that, because that is definitely a BSE question. So I'm happy to take that away.
Fantastic. Yeah, and as we say, this will be then included in the FAQ document that will be sent out to all parties in the middle of next week. So then we've got a question: does the change of registration data? Yeah, sorry.
That's example 2. Sorry, if you can just move to example 2 while George reads out the question.
Does the change of registration data include changes to the DPI, as that uses CSS messages that are written in the question? And example 2 does need an update. That's from a supplier.
Sure. No, I'm happy to take that one. So again, I think we set out one of the principles that this is not a full list of messages that may be required. So they might be like, we've tried to generalize these as much as possible. So if by DPI, I'm guessing you mean the domestic premise indicator. If that does require an input flow from CSS, then you may need to use that as part of your end-to-end process whilst you're executing it. However, as previously stated, CSS messages are not undergoing changes, so we would not, like, it would not be part of the assurance focus. So whilst you would need to do the full process, we won't be particularly checking for those.
Hi, sorry, that was me, just for clarification. I only mentioned it because you have them in example 1.
Okay, I mean, we can,
because we need to use them for that process. And on example 2, if it is for DPI, we'd need to use it again there. That's the only reason. Just for I can't think of the word, for completeness. That was the only reason I mentioned it.
That's fine. We can add something with a caveat, like for if required, because like there will be other registration data changes.
Yeah, because it's only on some of them. It would only be on some of them. I know it's a bit trickier, isn't it? I just spotted it. That was all. Thank you.
That's fine. We can add that.
The next question is, are participants expected to demonstrate their ability to zip or unzip files, certainly those related to the payload?
I think we need to take this back and respond with the FAQ.
If a participant is placing full reliance on identical systems, no matter what the role code, will this not apply to them, as this will have been covered previously?
I think it would matter what the role code is, because we'd need to ensure that the systems and processes would have the same role code to ensure that the systems and processes are the same. I think that yes, we'll be able to use the place of reliance policy on PIT, and that a party shouldn't necessarily need to retest anyway. However, that will be confirmed once the place of reliance policies have been reviewed.
And the next question.
I'm sorry, I was a bit confused around the mention of role code, because like, are you saying that for example, a supplier placing reliance on testing done by a metering service? Because there'd be different interactions that they'd be testing.
Sorry, can I just answer that? Apologies, it was my question. No, I'm just meaning it doesn't. If you doesn't matter if you're a distributor, a MOP, a supplier, if you've got all your systems in one place you're placing full reliance on, say, a managed service and someone else who've done it, does that mean that full reliance means if you can prove identical systems, processes, procedures, then you won't have to do all of this extra qualification testing because of the setup costs, test environments, all of that kind of stuff?
So again, like as Matt was explaining, that placing reliance will be assessed as part of that PQS submission, where you'd set out that this is the reason why we think we don't need to do any additional testing. But again, when you're determining that, if Francesca, if we can just go to example 1 again, please. Again, just taking this as an example, it would then mean that everything that's in that green boundary, all of that is identical. And if there was an element of, like, for example, CRM being different, that would then mean that the participant would need to demonstrate that the integration with the CRM is working, and they've done that. They basically prove that they can do that end-to-end process with the arrangements.
I just believed that the likes of CRM billing was out of scope in this, but in the cases I'm talking about, they are identical. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Our next question from an LDSO. So as there are no changes to the CSS flow, then why does the CSS adapter need to be in scope for PIT?
I think we said that it isn't. I think the actual the CSS messages would be, but the actual adapter itself is out of scope.
So I think they're talking about example 6.
So this is around wanting parties to demonstrate the full business process, which is why there is reference to CSS. But as V said, that wouldn't be the main focus of assurance when it comes to PIP, because like you said in the question, CSS messages aren't changing.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I have asked that question. So basically it is showing in the blue color, you know, and in the slide below it is saying that in scope item, whatever in the blue. So that's why there is some confusion.
Okay, I think it comes back to wanting to show the full kind of the business process end to end from your point of view, which is why that's been included.
Yeah, I think in practice, Nick, this will be, you know, be able to place reliance on the MPRS testing in this area from St Clement's, from SIT as well, Nihar. So, like I say, it's there for completeness, but I think you'll be able to demonstrate placing reliance for that particular element. And unless you think otherwise, Nick, I think that's probably the answer to that one.
Okay, thank you.
And then our next question from an LDSO is in relation to PIT scope and the deployment of MPRS, UMZO and Durabil into our infrastructure. 2 is interoperability, and 3, DIP adapter solution. Why does it align? Does that align with your expectations?
And I think on this one, it's probably best that we have a offline conversation, because we can probably discuss that in better detail. And so we can look to get that set up.
Fantastic. We'll set that up, and then any outcomes from that we will include in the FAQ. But Urshid has got his hand up if you'd like to comment.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. That's my question. This scope that I had mentioned was from the bilateral meetings that we had with one of your program team, and because again, coming back to the previous question, had a look into example 6, CSS simulator, CSS adapter. We never discussed this during the bilateral meeting, and you answered that in the previous conversation along with Jason, so that clarifies. But then I just wanted to ensure the scope doesn't keep changing. So this is what we agreed with in the bilateral meeting. So just want to get that confirmation from you or the team.
Yeah, and it's obviously worth saying with these examples, they're based on, you know, it's in generic example, so it's not overlaying, placing reliance, which obviously will change certain elements. So it is that kind of that generic level. So yeah, if that's what we've agreed bilaterally, that's fine. But I'll pick up anyway separately just to make sure that we're kind of fully on the same page.
Okay, thank you.
So our next question from a supplier. So in relation to consequential systems where response messages are being populated, how can it be that these are out of scope?
If we can go back to example 1, please, just so I have it on the screen while I talk through it. Anything that is being used for your message goes into the blue area. If it's not being, like, if you're not going to be using information from those systems into any outgoing messages, then that doesn't need to be a part of your system. Any information that other systems might read from what has been updated in your source system, again, we're not interested in that if it's not part of the end-to-end business process itself. Does that answer your question? Or unless there's like something specific you wanted to discuss around, like if there's a confusion between whether it's on the red side or the blue side.
Mike's not putting his hand up for the moment, so we'll carry on. The next question we have is from the DCP role. Will consequential changes be subject to testing in qualification testing?
So as we've set out, everything that we've shown as the boundary for PIT, we don't deem any of that as consequential changes. And as I previously stated, any other changes outside that boundary that parties may need to make for other processes within their organization to work, that currently is not within the scope of MHHS qualification.
And then we've got a question from someone who operates multiple roles. If the decision to include consequential changes in scope for PIT and qualification changes, this will have a huge impact to plans and contracts.
Duly noted, and it will be assessed as part of that change process. We would definitely not be requiring those as part of QT entry because none of those changes would be preventing you from starting qualification testing. It may, again, there's a big may. If anything was to be included in scope, that would then depend on the qualification approval that everything's been done and checked. Sorry, Jason, you wanted to come in?
No, I just wanted to make sure there weren't too many hairs running on this. We're not expecting DBT2 to be brought into the scope of the programme. That's why it's consequential change, because it's not included in the design. But I think that the activities that V is referring to is there is an activity underway with the IPA at the moment looking at what assurance might be required for consequential change outside the scope of the programme. So the IPA gave an update on that to PSG yesterday, that they are close to drawing their conclusions on that, and they'll report back on it. But we are not expecting that to become part of programme activities. As V said, that would be a significant change if it did come in, and we're not expecting that at the moment.
So our next question from a supplier. Will there be PIT guidance documents available for non-functional testing and operational testing? And if so, when are these likely to be made available?
So I think the timelines are set out in one of the program documents. I'm not sure, Nick, which document can we point people to for the non-functional and operational updates to the PIT guidance?
The PIT non-functional has either gone out or be going out shortly. I know that the SI are looking at the plan for the PIT guidance update. So I don't have an exact date, but we can look to clarify that as part of the FAQ document.
Cool.
Then from a supplier, again relating to the consequential change PIT, does this depend upon the specific business processes, whether or not it's in scope, or will it always be out of scope?
I think it should, yes, it will always be out of scope. However, it's down to the actual the sending and receiving of the market participant, the market messages. So yeah, I think we're under the impression that it would be always out of scope, but it's just depending on those market messages that are sent to and from.
And if anything does change, we will be communicating that, and we'll be, there'll be further comms in it.
So from another supplier, so the DTN gateway and the CSS simulator is specified out of scope for PIT. Are we required to test the CSS/DTN messages and provide PIT evidence?
So DTN messages are undergoing changes, so you would need to show us that you restructured them and they're operating correctly. There's no requirement to use the simulators and gateways that provided by DTN for it. You can use them if you want to. CSS messages are not changing, so we're not going to be focusing our assurance on any of the CSS to and from messages.
So of the examples provided, it seems to only apply to SIT participants and not non-SIT participants. Is there differences between the SIT and the non-SIT?
So these examples are for any party, I'd say, because
Yep.
that's how PIT scope will be determined. We did specifically hold this session on request of non-SIT parties, but again, I would say these are agnostic to route. They're more based on roles, market roles than
Yeah,
anything.
when we created these were done based on the business processes rather than the view of SIT parties or non-SIT parties.
So if there's a supplier being their own MDR, will PIT evidence be required for the interface between the supplier and the supplier data service?
I'll take that one away.
Okay, then we'll put that in the FAQ document that we'll make
Yeah, that's
available next week. So in relation to slide 6, it's very broad and conflicts with some of the examples. Can this be revised or recirculated, or do we want to talk through slide 6 now?
I mean, happy to receive specific feedback where you think that something's conflicting or can be clarified, because we want this to be as clear as possible. Yeah, I'm not sure if you want to discuss it now or you want to send us a note separately after the session. Either way.
Yeah, it's Lee. So it was my question. It was kind of this last. So I think all the things that have been produced for this are really super helpful to give kind of clarity. And I think the examples and talking through them are really useful. So thank you for that. It's this last sentence where it says this should include interfaces with any system within the architecture that generates or ingests it. So it's when if you've got a solution that ingests information, that's the bit I was struggling with. But having reread this, because you're saying that, I guess the key part for this is if it's needed to be able to carry out the process. Yeah. If any of the solutions are needed to carry out the MHHS processes end to end, that's the definition of the scope, isn't it? Because we all might have slightly different architectures, and some might have a CRM that does everything from meter to cash, whereas others might just have it very kind of narrow. For it about the solutions to support the processes end to end, I think is the key thing there. Answer my own question, but I think it was useful to kind of talk through that.
I know that's fine. I mean, we can clarify. I'm guessing the main bit that it generates or ingests information required as part of the end-to-end business processes.
Yeah, it's kind of I'd kind of stopped reading the sentence in a way. It's that to be able to complete the MHHS process end to end. That's the main part, isn't
it? Yeah, that is indeed.
Okay, cool. Top.
Thank you.
And I believe that answers the next question, which is about SIT non-SIT participants needing to provide evidence that market messages are processed and generated. I believe that's covered by that section as well. So for a non-SIT LDSO, in relation to PIT, how do we ensure that we received joined up feedback on our PIT approach and plan from the programme and code bodies?
Okay, sorry. So any responses that you are receiving is joined up. So Nick's team are receiving the responses, coming back to us, Matt and I are feeding into it, and collated responses going back to parties.
I think wherever it has to be a joined up approach, we will do that in the background. So you itself will only receive one response, but we will we would have both reviewed it in the background.
And then from an LDSO, can we include migration and non-functional testing as part of our placing reliance? As the one that we had submitted only included functional testing.
Yes, I mean, when we looked at placing reliance with the code bodies, we did look at it from a functional point of view, so we need to relook at it with that angle, but the principle of placing reliance could apply across those other types of testing as well.
Yeah. For non-functional, the only thing I will add the caveat is like if you share common infrastructure, then that's possibly one where you could potentially place reliance. However, if it's you won't be able to place a reliance on other parties where you don't have common infrastructure. So, yeah.
Did we want to take Chris while your hand's up?
Yeah, Nicola, there was a note that came out from the programme about placing reliance the other day that said that you wanted to update it, you could do. Is that for SIT participants or is that for non-SIT participants as well?
So that request was specifically for SIT participants to support preparation for SIT migration. I guess V or Matt, in terms of what people are putting in their PQS, should they try and consider non-functional migration if they want to place reliance for those as well?
Again, like if you're considering placing reliance for those aspects, please do mention it, because some of our decisions on who's testing when and in what order may depend on those decisions. So try to cover placing reliance from all the different aspects. We appreciate some of the detail. We'll need to go into a bit more detail later. So yeah.
So our next question from an LDSO, does the scope of non-functional testing include adapter services?
We will be updating Annex 1 shortly with the scope of non-functional testing, but yes, it would include adapter services.
And again from an LDSO, the slide example 6 shows the CSS adapter in blue, which is in scope for PIT, but the commentary just now confirmed that the CSS is out of scope. Please can we clarify which is correct?
So this is, we're expecting parties to try and test the business process full end to end, which is why this is covered. And it's worth saying that obviously placing reliance framework isn't across this, so you would need to take into account what placing reliance and what's being considered around that. But it's worth also saying that CSS messages, as they're not changing, won't be the focus of PIT assurance. That will be the dip in the DTN messages.
So the last question we have at the moment is from a DCP. When confirming the SDS supplier interface being in scope for PIT for the exchange of data as per the MDR role, could you confirm whose PIT it is responsible for detailing that? Is that the SDS themselves or the supplier?
Yeah, that's fine. We can do a piece around that. That's fine.
Where those handoffs are and who needs to provide that proof.
Yeah, that's fine.
Fantastic. Well, that's all the questions we've got at the moment. Like we said, the slides and the recording for today's session is going to be made available to everyone who's attended. And we'll send those out either end of day today or sort of middle of the day tomorrow. And then again, we're going to take all the questions that we've been through and provide an FAQ document that's going to be available, which will be around the middle of next week. And we'll either detail that in the clock or we'll send that out to all participants. We have just had one further question come in from a supplier. If placing reliance on a SIT party and the consequential change is out of scope, would limited information be required within the PIT test approach and plan?
Well, we would need you to show us how you think you've got sufficient coverage solely by placing reliance, is what I would say. Your PQS submission and your PIT approach and plan both need to tie up and tell us the story so that we can determine that. For any of the non-SIT parties, we've currently not agreed any placing reliance proposals just yet. So just mindful of that.
And then we just have one hand up by Chris, if you'd like to ask your question.
So yeah, on the back of all this conversation and FAQs, and will there be a new PIT guidance document? Because I'm conscious Nicola said there will be a new PIT guidance document for non-functional pretty soon. will some of this be driven into that document rather than being standalone?
Yeah, so we'll look to incorporate the definition and the examples into the PIT guidance as well. And there will also be a non-functional PIT guidance update, so we just need to work through timings of that and making sure that's kind of joined up in a way. But yes, there will be some additional changes to PIT guidance to cover off today's material, and there'll be an update for non-functional.
Fantastic. And if you do have any further questions, oh, sorry, Nahar, you've got your hand up. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, just a follow up on that, the previous question about the PIT guidance document that will publish. So if you can go to the milestone dates, there are some milestones for the non-society LDSO to announce on the next month to submit the PIT approach and plan document for regression, sorry, for migration and non-functional and operational as well. So if we know some tentative timeline when that would, the updated PIT document will be available, based upon that we can assess if there are any risk or delay need to happen from our side.
That's fine. So we can probably add a row for updates to PIT approach and plan for qualification parties.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And then just one final one that's come in. So non-functional test relies on parties' own message injectors. This means that every party will need to build. And doesn't it make sense to have the program provide a stud mechanism?
I would probably suggest raising this at one of the other working groups, possibly the qualification working group, because I don't think we might have the right audience to answer that question. I don't know if anyone from the program wants to respond to that now.
If not, oh, sorry.
No, I don't think so. I mean, Paul, we've had a discussion around this previously. I think we'll just have to address it through the working groups, as we said.
Yeah, the next qualification working group is Tuesday at 2. So it'll be a good time to bring that up then. Fantastic. Well, we'll wrap up now then. Thank you all for your time this afternoon. Some really insightful questions come in. And as discussed, we're going to provide some full answers to those and supply that back to everyone who's attended and make that publicly available as well for you to refer to as needed. But again, thank you all for coming. Thank you all to the presenters today. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, guys. Really good session. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, on.